The word ham planet is oftentimes used to describe certain human beings that are a little bit, dare I say, rotund, perhaps horizontally challenged. The phenomenon of this is known as the obesity epidemic, and we're going to go over the geography of this obesity epidemic in this video. We're going to go over the fact that our planet is kind of becoming a collective ham planet, as obesity rages across much of the world. And yes, I will be covering the United States first and foremost, but the rest of you guys are not off the hook. This by and large is becoming a global phenomenon at this point. I also want to keep in mind that I will briefly be covering how we got fat in this video, but I'm going to leave out the bulk of that conversation for my next video. Now keep in mind that throughout the vast majority of human history, more accurately prehistory, human beings were wandering around the savannas of Africa, or other places hunting and gathering. Food was scarce. KFC drive-thrus did not exist across the Great African Rift at the time. Humans had to expend a great deal of energy in order to hunt and gather food, oftentimes food that had not been genetically modified, or picked for particularly calorie-dense characteristics. On top of that, this food oftentimes had the ability to run away or even kill you. With the advent of agriculture, many humans stopped hunting and gathering and started to herd sheep and goats, eventually taking them up as sort of proto-pets, which provided them with milk and meat all year round, or at the very least sustained part of their diet throughout the year. Some humans opted for another choice, settling down in farming. Rather than focusing on dairy and fat, which herding provided them, they would focus on getting carbs from rice, corn, wheat, barley, or whatever grain was available in that specific region. This led to a surplus of calories through these starchy grasses, which eventually led to a diversification of labor, and eventually more settlements in towns. This population growth over the course of several centuries would continue to increase, with the exception of some bumps here and there. With the Industrial Revolution during the 1800s starting in Britain and eventually expanding elsewhere, people ditched agriculture for the most part in favor of working in factories. This would eventually switch into post-industrial economies. With the number of people working on farms continuing to dwindle, the size of those remaining farms massively increased. They became industrialized, large-scale operations with astounding efficiency and productivity for better and for worse. A large number of people no longer had to work in the fields, or even the factories for that matter. What was happening? Well, they were getting far easier access to a wide variety of food than ever before. As you can tell, it is quite possibly the greatest example of being the victim of your own success. Humans got so good at producing food that we switched from worrying about famines to worrying about being too fat. Now, before we get into the geographic regions, I just want to point out that I'm measuring obesity by the BMI, or body mass index. This basically compares your height and your weight to decide how fat you are. Now, this is by no means a perfect metric. For example, people who are very muscular can sometimes be considered obese even though they're not. This is because muscle weighs more than fat. BMI is also not very effective at measuring how fat elderly people are, since muscle loss definitely occurs as you age. Then again, how many obese 80-year-olds do you ever see? Overall, while the BMI is by no means a perfect metric, it is by and large a good usable metric that is useful not only for deciding who is overweight, but also who is obese. Just to let you know, a BMI of 25 is usually considered overweight, and 30 is obese. So technically, if you think about it, all those obese people are overweight, but not all overweight people are obese. So let's get to the regions. Of course, we have to start off with the good old US of A. Obviously, we've all heard of the stereotypes of fat Americans, and there's a large degree of truth to this stereotype. I use large intentionally, by the way, pun intended. However, there are also a large degree of complexity that cannot be encapsulated in a single fat joke. Contrary to popular belief, the United States is actually not the fattest country on the planet, however, it still ranks very high up on the list. It really wasn't until the post-war era when obesity really exploded in the United States. It was around the time during the 40s and 50s when sufficient changes happened to the very fabric of American society. The number of Americans living on farmsteads or working on the farms was dwindling. Farming had become so productive due to new technology that they no longer needed a bunch of small farms. On top of that, with more tech and more complex economies, many Americans eventually just ditched farming altogether. On top of that, it wasn't only agriculture that was decreasing as a major sector of the economy, but also industry as well. Both working on the farm and the factory require a tremendous amount of physical labor. However, more and more people were moving into the offices or retail fields that don't require exerting or burning as many calories. On top of that, in post-war America, many Americans started to embrace mass production. After all, during the World Wars, there was a tremendous need for industrialization and organization. Soldiers living and fighting abroad needed to make easy food that could be cheaply produced to avoid shortages of rations. The full-fledged industrialization led to mass output of processed and fast foods. During the 1950s, after all, is when McDonald's was founded, along with other fast food chains. And yes, while it is true that fast food gets a disproportionate amount of undue blame for the obesity epidemic, it has inarguably played a role. And I just kind of have to mention it. Another major contributor was suburbanization. Before this period, most Americans worked in the farm or in rural areas next to the farm. However, in post-war America, many people started to move to the suburbs. Not only from the countryside, but also from densely populated walkable cities. This suburbanization basically created an environment based around the car. You could drive to school, or the grocery store, or to work. Everything was centered around the automobile in the suburbs, rather than walking, cycling, or taking public transit. This was also the era in which the United States built the highway system, which was an incredible and remarkable infrastructural feat, but at the same time was done at the cost of investing into public transit or walkable communities. In fact, you can oftentimes tell the obesity rate of a neighborhood in the US by looking at its parcel fabric. Oftentimes, ones with cul-de-sacs and more serpentine roads tend to be more conducive to driving and thereby have more obesity. Whereas neighborhoods that have a grid-like system, as seen in many downtown areas, tend to be more conducive for walking and have lower rates of obesity. Houston is a quintessential example of the phenomenon on the worst end of the spectrum, as it has one of the most suburbanized urban fabrics and one of the highest obesity rates. Another social change that was happening around this time was women entering the workforce. During the 1950s, you usually had one man who was the breadwinner. However, by the 1970s and second-wave feminism, many women were starting to demand permanent entry into the workforce. With women entering the workforce rather than spending their entire time raising kids, this led to a great deal of time constraints, and many women resorted to feeding their children hyper-processed foods that are cheap and affordable and convenient, but at the same time oftentimes are very calorie-dense and lack nutritional value. They also tend to have a lot of excess sugar and salt. This in particular has led to an increase in childhood obesity, and by the 1980s is when the obesity epidemic in the United States fully took on an epidemic form. It is quite interesting because if you look at people, say during the 1960s in America, you don't actually see too many fat people. Now let's break down the United States by regions, because not all of these supposedly equal states are equal when it comes to fatness. Overall, the northeast of the country has fairly low obesity rates. A lot of this has to do with, again, a disproportionate number of people living in urbanized cities like New York City, as well as many of these people having higher rates of income and education. States like Massachusetts and others tend to have the lowest obesity rates in the country. However, this changes drastically as you move south. There's even a concept of the diabetes belt, or the obesity belt, sometimes even just called the stroke belt. Southern states tend to have the highest proportions of obese people in the US, and this is due to a variety of factors. The fattest state in the country is Mississippi, which is simultaneously the poorest state in the country. And it's pretty much at the bottom of the barrel of every single metric in the nation. There's even a saying in many southern states, thank God for Mississippi, because if it had not been for Mississippi, they would have been at the bottom of the list too. On face value, a lot of people attribute this to the southern diet being so tasty. I mean, just look at this. But then again, basically gorging on foods made out of butter, flour, and deep frying isn't exactly a recipe for not being the stroke belt. However, this doesn't completely explain the phenomenon. Southern states also tend to have a disproportionate amount of rural and suburban people rather than densely populated urban environments. This means that people, for the most part, need cars and trucks to get around. This part of the country is also poorer and less educated than the rest of the nation, and as a result, people have less access to knowledge and the ability to eat healthy foods and live healthier lifestyles. There is also a controversial racial component. While obesity affects all races, it is disproportionately found in African American populations, particularly African American women. Some people attribute this phenomenon to the fact that African Americans eat soul food, which was basically inspired by the leftovers during the days of brutal slavery. Southern African Americans have a very complex relationship with soul food. Many view it as a core part of their heritage and identity. Others view it as a byproduct of racism and something that kills their people slowly. Another factor is that a lot of African Americans in the South, along with rural whites, live in food deserts. These are areas that, due to a variety of complex factors, be it a lack of prosperity, high crime rates, or oftentimes just a lack of economic viability, lead to grocery stores shutting down and not opening up again. As a result, dollar stores and fast food chains tend to open up as a replacement, which don't provide as much nutritional value. Another part of the country that is notorious for having high obesity rates is the Midwest. The Midwest is pretty much the breadbasket of the US, producing a tremendous amount of food for not only the rest of the country, but the rest of the world, particularly corn. Corn by itself is not bad. However, lots of corn used in artificial corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup is not exactly the healthiest ingredient. Yet it's incorporated into an astonishing amount of processed foods. From almost any food product to baby diapers. Yeah, baby diapers oftentimes have artificial corn syrup in them. The modern Midwest oftentimes is known as the Rust Belt, the region that used to be industrialized but by and large has been deindustrialized. This has led to a lot of economic stagnation and relative poverty in the region compared to other portions of the United States. It also doesn't help given the fact that many of the signature dishes tend to confuse dishes like pizza for casserole, as seen with the Chicago deep dish pizza. So let's move on to a more positive note, to the western half of the United States, where you do get lower obesity rates, on average than the rest, with Colorado having the lowest obesity rates of any state. I cannot point to any specific issue for this phenomenon in Colorado, but I'm gonna guess that it probably has to do with Colorado's strong reputation for outdoor recreation. Coloradans are very proud of their beautiful, scenic environment, and many of them take advantage of this. And this has produced a culture which has been very active, and by and large has led to lower obesity rates. The state also has a high elevation, and Denver is the highest elevated major city in the United States. And you do burn fat by breathing more, and you tend to breathe more when you're breathing thinner air. This may or may not have resulted in a lower obesity rate, but I still need to see more scientific data to confirm. Most other Western states also have pretty low rates of obesity in comparison to the South and the Midwest. California and much of the Pacific Northwest tend to have a sort of lifestyle revolving around a lot of healthier diets and healthy practices like yoga. There's a lot of pseudoscience that goes along with this, and to what extent this is based off of pseudoscience and trendiness, and to what extent this is based off of actual science and wanting to live a healthy lifestyle is still up for debate. Nonetheless, these parts of the country do by and large have lower rates of obesity. Now, I mentioned the United States, but the rest of the world is not off the hook. For that reason, I'm gonna move on to my country, Canada, which is also going through an obesity epidemic. Can we cut to the Canada footage? Are you there? Almost there? There we go. Canada also has an obesity epidemic, not quite as bad as the US is, but not something to brag about either, with pretty high obesity rates being largely the byproduct of many of the same forces you see in the US. I mean, if you think Canadians live very healthy lifestyles, just take a look at some of our most iconic foods. Back bacon, maple syrup, poutine. I'm surprised we're not even more obese. It's worth noting that there are also regional differences in Canada when it comes to obesity rates, with the maritime regions having the highest. These regions tend to be more rural and poor. On the other hand, British Columbia on the other side of the country has the lowest. British Columbia has a very strong recreational culture, kind of like Colorado. It's also quite easy to get around Vancouver by public transit compared to other parts of the country. And on top of that, they also have a large Asian population, and generally speaking, Asians tend to have the lowest obesity rates of any major racial group. Is that fat-phobic of me to say? Sure, call me that if you want to use that term. This entire video is pretty much fat-phobic. So let's move on down south of the United States to Mexico. Mexico is a country that has dealt with a very recent upsurge in obesity. According to some metrics, it is actually more obese than the United States. After all, Mexico switched from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy very recently. Mexican food is also known for being incredibly nutritious. However, there is an uptick in the rise of ultra-processed foods in the Mexican diet. On top of that, it doesn't help that they fry everything in lard. Contrary to popular belief, Mexicans do not use avocado oil, which is a much healthier alternative. They tend to use pig fat. On top of that, Mexicans also have some of the highest consumption rates of soft drinks. Soft drinks and pig lard don't work very well, especially when you're not mitigating the situation with some good old avocado oil. These soft drinks are basically like guzzling sugar water. Many of these trends have moved their way into the Caribbean, with Caribbean island nations of the Bahamas and Central American nations like Belize also having extremely high obesity rates due to similar factors. While obesity rates in South America are not as bad as those in North America, they are steadily increasing, with Argentina and Chile having the highest obesity rates of all. I suppose this is in part due to the fact that these countries are the wealthiest on the continent and don't have to deal with any significant food scares. In Argentina, for example, it is one of the biggest producers of red meat. A lot of this ends up feeding their diet, so when you've got a diet of dulce de leche and steaks, you're bound to get some fat people. Let's move on to the other side of the Atlantic, to Europe. A lot of Europeans like to act smug, like fat people don't exist on their continent. Well, I'm here to inform you, just in case you've been in denial, that there are fat people in Europe. In fact, there are a lot of them. Not as many as the United States, but certainly a lot. First, let's start off with the UK. The UK and Ireland have some of the highest obesity rates in Europe. After all, they tend to be more suburbanized than mainland Europe. On top of that, British cuisine is not exactly the most healthy, with the most iconic and possibly only edible dish you guys have ever created being deep-fried beer batter fish and chips. Traditional British diets oftentimes include a lot of white bread, a lot of butter, a lot of cream, a lot of milk, and a lot of red meat. I love you Brits, but I gotta call you out on that. These don't necessarily make you fat if you portion them properly, but they're very calorie dense. And as a result, you oftentimes see a lot of overweight people. So let's move on to mainland Europe. Generally speaking, mainland Europe tends to have quite a bit of a spectrum, and by and large, Eastern European countries tend to have higher obesity rates than Western European countries. This is not a surprise since many Eastern European diets are very calorie dense. I suspect that this is due to their cold climate, which basically results in them using a lot of butter and lard rather than, say, olive oil. A lot of their food also tends to be heavily based off of potatoes and sunflower seeds and pork, which are also quite calorie dense. Colder climates may also make people consume more, since after all, their bodies require more energy. Many people could argue that the flavor and taste of the food contributes to people eating more of it and thereby getting fat. Much of the statistical data and evidence in Europe seems to debunk this theory, though, at least to some degree. Obviously, the flavor of food is subjective, but generally speaking, if you look at statistics, Italy is considered to be the country with one of the lowest obesity rates in Europe, but is simultaneously known for having really tasty food. Only around 20% of Italians are obese, and roughly 40% of them are overweight, one of the lowest on the continent. This is despite the fact that Italy is renowned for having some of the best cuisine in the world. Part of this is because Italians take their food very seriously when it comes to quality and proportions. The Italian government even has an entire bureaucracy dedicated to the quality of food. Italy is also a country that places a tremendous amount of value on aesthetics and beauty, including human aesthetics. As a result of this, there's a lot of societal pressure to look good, and part of looking good is maintaining a healthy body weight. This overemphasis on aesthetics isn't always a positive factor, however. For example, there's also a great deal of discrimination not only against obese people, but towards disabled Italians, since they don't live up to the aesthetic that society wants them to live up to. To further elaborate on why the taste of a certain type of food doesn't necessarily result in obesity, because it's so yummy, we have to go to another nation called Iceland, which has one of the highest rates on the European continent of obesity, despite having food that by and large is, well, how do I put it lightly, disgusting? Yeah, their most well-known dish is an ammonia-stenching fermented piss shark, which is apparently their national dish. It's so bad that in order to wash it down, you need to drink vodka, which pretty much tastes like rubbing alcohol. With the exception of Italy, though, much of Southern Europe actually struggles with high rates of being overweight as well. This is despite the fact that their diets are usually very healthy, containing a lot of olive oil, fruits, and vegetables. However, at the same time, they oftentimes have a problem with portioning their food. So this might have led to an increase of obesity. However, I've yet to see any definitive conclusions as to why Spain, for example, tends to have higher rates of obesity than Italy, so the jury is still out. Let's move on to another part of the world. One part of the world that you don't necessarily associate with obesity, but actually has one of the highest obesity rates in the world, and that is the Middle East and North Africa. This might be a shock to many people, but the Middle East has some of the highest obesity rates on the planet. Some of these nations have higher obesity rates than even the United States. The bulk of obesity rates are situated in the wealthy Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman. These nations were, in the first half of the 20th century, impoverished, but today are incredibly wealthy, mostly due to oil wealth along with some very good policy choices. When these countries became very wealthy, oftentimes they wanted to buy big cars and big houses. They, after all, were new money, a nation of new money. And a lot of them built suburbanized cities. You can see gigantic skyscrapers, and a lot of these countries, or a lot of these cities, like Abu Dhabi and Doha, by and large, have a large portion of people living in suburban sprawl around these skyscrapers. I used to live in Dubai, and I recall that you pretty much couldn't go anywhere without a car unless you were around the Sheikh Zayed Road highway system. Another factor is easy access to high-caloric food. Dubai has in fact the highest density of restaurants in the world, with an astounding diverse array of international restaurant chains. Eating out in many of these countries is just a part of life. Not only eating out, but also eating out very frequently. Restaurant meals are by and large very calorie dense, as they're designed by chefs to maximize taste. Another factor is that many of these wealthy Gulf states are incredibly hot during the summertime. Because of the heat, it requires a lot of people to basically stay indoors in air-conditioned malls, and stay in air-conditioned homes and air-conditioned cars. This inability to really enjoy the outdoors and recreation for a third to half of the year reduces a lot of people exercising, and results in more people being overweight. Another factor is that in Muslim-majority countries, there is oftentimes either a ban on alcohol or heavy restrictions placed on alcohol for Muslims themselves. Not all of these countries necessarily ban alcohol, but drinking isn't as common. As a result of the ban of one vice like alcohol, many people resort to other vices to get their dopamine hits, namely food. Many people argue the reason why Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have such astonishing high rates of obesity is because people are getting their dopamine from fat, sugar, and salt rather than beer, wine, and liquor. On top of that, another dynamic is the obesity rate of women in this particular part of the world, which is quite higher than those of men. Many people attribute this to the fact that many native women have to be dressed up in garbs that cover their bodies, and without the incentive to attract a mate, and given the family structures that are oftentimes clan-based, which result in you marrying your cousin or second cousin, this basically leads to less and less women wanting to work out or be fit in order to attract a man. It's controversial, but that's the way it is. So let's move on to Sub-Saharan Africa, which is unsurprisingly the place in the world where obesity rates are among the lowest. In fact, you can look at Africa as a whole, and you can see higher rates of obesity in North Africa with cultures similar to the Middle East, but if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, you actually have far lower rates of obesity. This is until you get to South Africa at the very end of the continent, where obesity rates are also very high, in some cases even higher than the US. Overall, Sub-Saharan Africa is the least prosperous part of the world, and the part of the world with the most food scarcity. This may explain why wealthier African countries tend to have higher rates of being overweight, whereas the poorest countries have the lowest obesity rates, such as Ethiopia, with a whopping 4.5%. However, this is not something to brag about. After all, during the 1970s, Ethiopia was pretty much synonymous with famines. A great deal of the lack of obesity in Africa, again, has to do with food scarcity. So while it's good to find out that they have a low obesity rate, oftentimes these people are suffering from malnutrition, which throughout the vast majority of human history was a far bigger problem than obesity. Overall, poverty plays a significant role in whether people are malnourished, obese, or just normal. Generally speaking, in the poorest of the poor countries, the poorest people will be the least likely to be obese because they're struggling with malnutrition. However, when you get to middle-income countries, and especially wealthy countries, oftentimes it's the poor people in those countries who are more likely to be obese because those countries don't deal with food scarcity, and by and large, poor people tend to have access to hyper-processed foods for the most part. So let's move on to another part of the world that is oftentimes overlooked in the discussion of obesity, and by and large overlooked for a good reason, and that is the Indian subcontinent. India oftentimes struggles, if anything, with a lack of people overeating. In fact, we kind of hope Indians do overeat a little bit more, or more accurately have the opportunity to do so. Putting that aside, a lot of India's urban centers do share some of the same trends of globalization that you see in the developed world, namely in cities like New Delhi and Mumbai, which have higher rates of obesity compared to the rest of the country. These people in urban areas overall tend to be wealthier than those in poor rural regions. A lot of them have easier access to food, and as a result, they have higher obesity rates. But by and large, I think that there just needs to be a lot more research done on obesity in the Indian subcontinent before I come to any resounding conclusions. And for that reason, I'm gonna switch to another part of the world that is not known for high obesity rates, and that is East Asia. East Asia tends to buck the trend, because there are a lot of countries that are very wealthy and prosperous, but nonetheless have very low obesity rates. China, for example, has become very modernized at a very rapid pace and has pushed millions upon millions of people out of poverty. However, their obesity rate is like 6.2%. Japan's also a very wealthy country, and its obesity rate is at 3% roughly. These numbers are pretty damn low, given the fact that wealth is very prominent in many of these nations, especially in Japan. The only East Asian country that has a pretty damn high obesity rate is Malaysia, and that country has some similarities to the Middle East, especially when it comes to their Malay population. For the countries of Southeast Asia, it's fairly obvious. After all, these countries are developing nations. A lot of them are working in agricultural and industrial sectors, which require burning a lot of calories. Now, I previously stated in this video that generally speaking, in rich and middle income countries, rich people tend to be more fit and poor people tend to be fatter. But in poor countries, the poorest tend to be the least fat and the richest tend to be the most fat. However, Asia just kind of bucks this trend as well. Here you have a lot of countries that are developing rapidly, but you don't see the same increase in obesity rates that you see elsewhere in the world. This is not to say that these countries or people groups are immune from overindulgence. After all, Indonesia and other countries nearby have colossal rates of tobacco consumption. What this does mean is that a lot of these East Asian countries oftentimes are seeking vices from other sources. Outside of chain smoking, another example as to why East Asians tend to have lower rates of being overweight and obese might be due to heavy social pressures that exist in these countries. Oftentimes, these countries are heavily based off of the concept of shame. Shame-based cultures tend to be very collectivist. They tend to view the nation as a whole, as one. Oftentimes, they tend to be quite blunt and have no filter when ridiculing members of their own group for not fitting in with social standards. Lectures about the harms of fat shaming that we hear in the West would be very, very rare in these sort of cultures. Some countries, like South Korea, have very low obesity rates despite their wealth. In South Korea, there's a very large collectivist shame-based culture. But there's also a great emphasis on aesthetics and beauty. This is known as K-beauty, which has become popular throughout the world. Quite similar to the way that Italians love beauty. So, speaking of Asia and really moving on from Asia, let's go beyond that region to the Oceania, the last portion of the world I'm going to be discussing. Australia and New Zealand are Western nations with similar cultures to what you'd see in North America. A lot of suburbanization, a lot of processed food, and as a result, the obesity rate in a country like New Zealand tends to be pretty high. However, not as high as many of the island Pacific nations off the coast, or more accurately, way off the coast. The highest rates of obesity in the world are not in the United States, not in the Middle East, but in this part of the world. In many of these nations, the obesity rate is over 50, sometimes even over 75%. There are a variety of reasons to explain this, both nature and nurture. Some have pointed out the fact that Polynesians, for example, tend to have higher bone density, and generally speaking, tend to be rather physically large. I mean, just look at The Rock. He's Samoan. However, biological explanations don't tell the full story. Many people evoke the concept of what is called New World Syndrome. New World Syndrome is a phenomenon in which many indigenous peoples of the Pacific, Australia, and the Americas tend to have a preponderance for various health concerns, be it diabetes, alcoholism, or obesity. Some people have argued that limited access to high-calorie foods or alcohol historically has led to many of these people groups being less accustomed to dealing with the temptations. And the process and abundance has led to a massive uptick in obesity, as our bodies evolutionary have not adapted to high amounts of fat in these regions. This is very difficult to prove or disprove, but the concept does make some degree of sense. However, I would need to see more empirical evidence to state it as an objective fact. Another factor is that in many of these Polynesian, Melanesian, and Micronesian island nations, the bulk of their diet came from products like fish, coconuts, tubers, and other foods that are high in nutritional value. Many people have argued that coconut oil is one of the healthiest oils, a position that has by and large been discredited, as many Polynesian peoples who have migrated to New Zealand have adapted Western diets based off of white bread and red meat, while continuing to use coconut oil. And lo and behold, it doesn't stop them from becoming fat. Putting some of these problems with coconut oil aside, it's quite clear that the Polynesian diet isn't necessarily bad. After all, fish tends to be very high in omega fatty acids. The use of tubers, fruit, and vegetables in your diet to a large degree is also very good. However, many of these nations are small and isolated. As a result, in the modern age, many of them have had to move from subsistence agriculture to other forms of, let's just say, food, if you could call spam food. And this is why spam is synonymous with Hawaii after all. During the events of World War II in the Pacific, you had these isolated island nations, or tribal groups if you could call them that, once living a way of life that their ancestors had for thousands of years. But all of a sudden, they came into contact with some of the most advanced nations on the planet. Many of these militaries were feeding their soldiers military-grade food, which was oftentimes heavily processed and cheap. The most infamous was spam, which is basically a bunch of coagulated meat in a can. Given the vast distances of the Pacific, processed food was the way to go. And in many ways, this hasn't changed. After all, many people in Pacific Island nations have transitioned from subsistence agriculture to the service sector or resource based economies in a commercial setting, which has resulted in far higher demands for processed food. The most infamous example is the fattest country on the planet, Nauru, or Nauru. I've heard both pronunciations, someone correct me. This nation used to be very wealthy for a brief period of time due to large phosphorus deposits on the island as a result of a ton of bird shit, literally. However, after exhausting the mineral deposits and getting tremendously wealthy, their economy kind of just tanked, and they eventually became a vassal state of Australia, slash a penal colony for detained illegal immigrants. Today, the island of Nauru has 71% of the population being obese. Not just overweight, obese, which is the highest of independent nations. At this point, the worldwide trend looks pretty bleak. However, it's important to note that a lot of these obesity epidemics that we're seeing around the world are a product of the success of the modern world. Throughout much of human history, it wasn't obesity that we feared, but rather starvation, or at the very least malnutrition. A phenomenon at this point that only exists in the poorest and most rural parts of the world today. Our Darwinian inclinations have gotten the best of us, and it's a perfect example of how slow biological evolution is oftentimes compared to the rapid changes of cultural evolution. Currently, there are new outbreaks in science that may well quell the obesity epidemic, such as Ozempic, but this has yet to be proven for sure. In my next video, we're going to be covering how we got so fat, the various technological, social, and economic factors that have led to this, mixed in with, of course, our own biology. If you want to stay tuned, I recommend subscribing. Plus, it makes me feel better. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.